Irish Breakdown Nation. Welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. It is Tuesday, February 11th. The offseason is rolling. We're a couple days out from Valentine's Day. So, ladies and gents, make sure that you get your plans finalized, dinner reservations in there. I got my flowers ordered today because Lauren works about 45 minutes away from here and I work from home. So, whatever you guys got to do, make sure that you guys get ready for it. But outside of Valentine's
Angela's
Day,
birthday's on Sunday as well, so I kind of have to.
Go.
I always have to do those kind of back to back to back, which kind of works for flowers because I can get her one big bouquet and then just like. But hey, real quick, this is not a company that we are sponsored by. This is just a company that I've used, but I actually have a monthly subscription to a place called Bouqs.com, Bouqs.com. And you can actually have like a monthly subscription and then they'll kind of like pick flowers for you. They send it the first of every month is what I do. But you can go in there and edit whatever you want to do. And my wife loves tulips and roses. So you can go in there and pick out those different orders. And so she loves them. So if your wife, and it's easy to do because you don't have to like go to the store. They travel great. There's only been one time they ever arrived damaged and they replaced it for free, like within a week. So really cool company. Again, we're not sponsored by them. It's just as a husband, my advice to you guys, if your wife likes flowers, this is a really easy way to do it. And they're really good flowers. They're better than what I get, from Martin's down the street. So just a little something for you guys there. Bouqs.com is a really cool place that we use. So yeah, there you go. Check it out.
Well, there we go. Be sure to check out Bouqs.com. But before we get to Valentine's Day, before we get to all the fun festivities for Angel's birthday on Sunday, we got a lot of football we got to talk about because offseason is still rolling, baby. So we have some topics we're going to cover today. The big one being Notre Dame's passing offense. Now, we've talked a lot about it so far this offseason, but we're really going to sit down and take some time today to dive into the improvements. And we're going to start big picture. We're going to start with the why. And some of it might sound a little obvious to some, but we're going to dive into why the passing offense has to improve. And we're going to kind of dive into, some of the issues. And we're going to talk through what has kind of prevented Notre Dame from taking that next step into becoming a more efficient passing offense. We're going to talk through what we must see. And we're going to talk through what 2025 should look like based on personnel, based on the coaching coming back. Speaking of the coach coming back, we're going to talk about reasons for optimism. Hint, hint, Mike Denbrock may or may not be in that list. And then we're going to wrap everything up today with a mailbag. We're going to go for about an hour. So throughout the show, guys, whatever questions pop into your mind, whichever ones that may have not gotten answered in other shows or something that just pops in spur of the moment, be sure to throw it into the chat. And then as always, super chats get bumped up to the top. But Bryan, before we jump into everything, how you doing today, man?
Man, I'm great. We're talking pass game. I always get excited about this. And, we're going to kind of, throughout the offseason, break down the team and look at areas where, boy, this is a strength. It's got to stay a strength. I'm going to have some film breakdowns to match this. I'm not sure when they'll come out, but I'm going to break down different parts of the pass game and things that we like and things that we don't like. And that, of course, be on the premium board. But I'm excited about this one because we've talked about this before on the show about how the pass game's got to get better. And in some ways, I think they made some improvements this year, which we'll kind of jump into in certain areas. And we'll explain like what we mean. There's this notion that, well, you got to look like LSU 2019 or Bama 2020. I'm like, no, you don't. But there are certain things that if you look at the teams that are winning championships and teams that are winning consistently year to year, especially over a period of time, there's things that are common. They don't all do the same thing. Some teams run the ball effectively. Some teams don't. Some teams play great defense. Some teams play good defense, but they're elite on offense. There's different aspects of it. Some teams are zone scheme. Some teams are gap scheme. I mean, there's all types of different ways to win. But there are certain things you can look at and say, these are some consistent ingredients to championship teams. Now, there's anomalies here and there, but these are sort of the key ingredients. And here's where Notre Dame is in this area. And here's where Notre Dame's got to get to. And I felt like since we just kind of talked about the quarterbacks the other day, that it'd be kind of a good time to go right into the pass game and jump into like, hey, look, here's what we like, here's what we don't like. And if Notre Dame wants to compete for a championship, not just, get there, but compete for a championship, but then to do it with some consistency, Trev, that's the other big thing, right? Is not just to do it, get to the championship game once every, 10, 12 years, which they did, 2012 and then 2024. But to actually get there and win it, to be able to win those big games on a consistent basis, There's just certain things they're going to have to be able to do. And we're going to break all that down. And I'm very much excited about that. And I think this is a great place to start because, like with run game, it's like there's going to be things we're going to break down that they can get better here and maybe make some adjustments there. But it's like you're pretty good at running football. Just keep doing what you're doing, you know what I mean? But it's going to come down to when teams are going to say, "Well, we're not going to let you run the ball on us." Can you still beat them and still put up big numbers and still be a dominant football team? And that's where Notre Dame has got to get to.
I love talking passing offense. Obviously, a little bias. You're talking to two former quarterbacks here. So for me, this is what I love diving into. So, in that good spirit, let's kind of dive into where we're going to start here. And we're going to talk about, Bryan, you touched on it. Notre Dame has to improve here, but what's the why behind it? Like I said, some of it might be obvious, but the other is you look at the comparisons and you look at the commonalities between teams that have won the national championship in years past. So, what does it mean? Right. And Bryan, when you look at these numbers that you compiled here, what does some of the data tell us about passing offenses that have won the national championship?
Well, number one, it tells you, Trevor, that in this era, in this common era, there's still different ways to win. People love to pigeonhole it into, well, this team that's winning now does this, so everybody needs to be like that. And I've never been one of those people. I've never been one of those people that jumps into the whole, well, this is the best team in the country, so you've got to be what they are. I've like that never works because by the time you catch up to where they are, they're going to have evolved in advance and they're going to still be ahead of you. It's about figuring out who we are, what we can be as a program, where we can be dominant, and then just trying to make sure that we looking at it from just a team trying to compete with the best teams, make sure that we can build ourselves up to where we can be the best version of ourselves in a way that can compete with them. So it's not about chasing those teams because all these teams that you look at in this statistical breakdown, they do things very differently. Ohio State's very different from Michigan, who was very different from Georgia, who was very different from the way Alabama was in 2020 and Clemson and LSU was in 19. And then those teams are actually probably the two most similar is Alabama and LSU, but they were all very different than how Clemson does things. And there's just certain things that you look at, Trevor, and say there's certain commonalities between all of those teams. And when you look at Notre Dame, you say, well, look, they're obviously not in that same range. They're not competing with those teams in those areas. They're way off of where those teams are. And if they want to compete with those teams on a regular basis, they're going to have to be more effective in those certain areas. And the reality is you can say this, well, Notre Dame's got to throw the ball like LSU did or like Alabama does. No, they don't. They just have to be, with what they're doing, they have to be a lot better at it. It's not something that requires you to say, well, you got to go away from being O-line you and go away from having great running backs and you've got to just go out there and get the next Jamar Chase and Jamar Jefferson. It's like, well, no, you don't. You just have to make sure that you still be great at what you do, but you have to be better at it. And you have to say, hey, how are we falling short? Why are we falling short in the big games? Because that's the other thing is we're going to talk about these statistics right here. But the other part of it's going to be is there's some times where Notre Dame has had good statistics overall over the course of a season, but their team is not effective because they don't do those things in the big games. And last year, meaning 2023, is going to be a big example of that. And we're going to explain kind of what that means. So it really just comes down to becoming a team that's more dynamic in every area of offense. And that's something that Notre Dame has been falling behind. And in order to get to that level, they're going to have to be there. Because, we'll dive into it, Trev, but there's some specifics that you see here for these teams. And we'll dive into it here. We'll dive to it more as we get into it. But there's just some things that we've looked at as we study the data that tells us, hey, they've got to be better here. But it's one thing to look at the data, and it's another thing to say, Trev, why that data matters. What impact does that data have? How does that impact you, practically speaking, as a football team on game day? And that's more important than just looking at numbers and saying, hey, you got to get to 9 yards an attempt. Okay, well, that only tells me a certain part of the story. Let's get into the why, and that'll be part of this conversation as well.
Context when you look at these numbers is everything. And you brought up Notre Dame's 2023 stats, their breakdowns for the passing offense. And that, I think, provides some really, really good context as to why your goal as an offensive coordinator, why your goal as a team, as a passing offense can't just be, well, let's just get to that number. It has to be when those numbers come into effect, right? The grandest of stages. You know, you going through and you just take a look at what Notre Dame's offense did this year with Riley Leonard. It was almost a tale of two different halves in the playoffs. Against IU, 6.3 yards per attempt. Against Georgia, it was 3.8, but they passed for 90 yards. But then you go through and you look at the shift and what happened with Penn State and with Ohio State. Riley Leonard finished the game with 9.7 yards per attempt against Penn State. Ended the game with 8.2 yards per attempt against Ohio State. And you saw it at times throughout the regular season. He finished the game with 11.7 yards per attempt against Army. That was a really good passing performance. And what we talked about with the quarterbacks in a previous show was you could tell when Riley Leonard was feeling it early and when he wasn't. And that the Army game was one of those games is when he was feeling it early. But the level of consistency that it has to happen at needs to grow in 2025. There's a lot of different reasons to be optimistic, which we'll talk through later. There's a lot of different things they can do schematically to help improve those numbers. But moral of the story is the passing offense has to become more dynamic. I love that you use that word. And it has to become more consistent because at other times we've seen it's been really great against Central Michigan. It's been really great against the service academies who are quality programs. But let's just call a spade here. You're not going to be facing an Army or Navy secondary in the semifinals of the college football playoff. So for all those reasons, Notre Dame's pass offense is going to have to improve.
I mean, you look at the numbers, Trevor, and that's what the teams that have won championships in recent years have done. That's their numbers, right? So you see some variances in there. You look at 28.4 attempts per game. So what these numbers mean, APG is attempts per game, CPG is completions per game, PCT is the completion percentage, yards per game. That's obvious. YPA is yards per attempt, YPC yards per completion, TDs, INTs, and then quarterback rating. And you start to see certain floors. But you also see some variances, right? I mean, what you saw from Michigan in 2023 is a lot closer to what we saw from Georgia in 2021, but very different from what Georgia was in 2022. And different, obviously, from what Clemson was in 2020 and 2018. And I'm at some very interesting comparisons between that Clemson team in 2018 and Notre Dame in 2018. So, but the other part of it too is, Trev, is it's not just about the numbers; it's about the overall impact that those numbers have, and can you have them in big games? Because when you look at Notre Dame, it's not just that their numbers don't compare. And I'm going to pull this up. So you look at completion percentage, lowest one on there is 64.9. And then you look at Notre Dame in the same period, they've been over 64.9 once. What year was that? It was this year. It was with Riley Leonard. You look at Notre Dame and saying, okay, well, you look at the comparison of these other teams. It's yards per attempt. The lowest was 8.2. The next lowest after that was 8.9. And that 8.2 team has got a little bit of an asterisk because they were a lot more dynamic later in the year as their true freshman quarterback got more and more experience. And that obviously played a big role in it. So you can say, okay, well, they were only 8.2 over the course of the season. But look at what they did in the postseason. Trevor Lawrence was 8.4 against Notre Dame in the semifinals, and then 10.8 against Alabama. He was 10.9 against South Carolina. So you started to see that get better and better and better. Clemson that year was 10.8 in a win, or Trevor was 10.8 and 10.3 in a win over Texas A&M as part of the rotation for that. But just overall, you saw that get better and better and better as the season went on after they made the quarterback change. And so that factors into the conversation as well, because as a team they were at 8.2. Trevor was actually at 8.3. So as the other quarterbacks were a little bit higher than him. But they also they went 1 of 6 on non-quarterback throws. So that's another thing that I thought was very interesting. They went 1 of 6 for 2 yards. So if you take that, let's go ahead, 41.85. If you look at the numbers, I thought this was kind of interesting. But if you actually look at that and divide it by, you take out those other passes, they were actually 8.33, which gets you a little bit higher than that 8.2. But the point is still the same. But as I said, in the big games, they were a lot better than that. But that was also the true freshman quarterback. You look at Notre Dame in the last 6 years. How many times have they even been over? And that 8.2 is the anomaly. That's the low number. Look at Notre Dame in that same period of time. They've been over 8.2 once. That's the low number. They've only been in that range where the other teams are, which is around that 8.9 to 9 or higher average. They've only done that once, and that was last year with Sam Hartman. Well, then you say, okay, well, that's pretty good. Maybe you need another Sam Hartman type of guy. Well, I mean, that's a different conversation for a different day. But here's the rub. Against Ohio State, 7.0 yards per attempt. Against Duke, 7.4. Against Louisville, 6.7. Against USC, 6.3. Against Clemson, 4.9. So in your biggest games of the year, you were way below that. Why did they rank 9.1? 10.9 against Army or Navy, 11.4 against Tennessee State, 12.7 against Central Michigan, 11.5 against a Pitt team that was 3-9, 9.6 against a Wake Forest team that was 4-8, and 10.0 against that was Sam Hartman, against a Stanford team that was also 3-9. And then you look at what Steve Angeli did in his start. They went 12.2 against an Oregon State team that was depleted. That's not meant to be a knock on Steve Angeli. The point is to simply show Notre Dame's pass offense can do those things against inferior opponents. What they have not been able to do is to do those things in the biggest moments. And we started to see that a little bit this year, Trev. Like you mentioned, 9.7 from Riley Leonard against Penn State, 8.2. Now, we'll break down like, okay, you barely won the one game and you lost the other game because you didn't start doing that till the second half when you were down. But we'll get to that. But you started to see that against Army, a ranked team, 11.4 this season in that category. But then there was 3.8 against Georgia. There was 6.3 against Indiana. So you started to see Louisville was only 7.1. Texas A&M was only 5.3. So you say that there's still plenty of room to improve. But you look at these numbers, Trev, and Notre Dame's way below most years in a lot of these categories. And you'll see yards per catch the last couple of years has been a little bit lower. Notre Dame is kind of on point with a lot of those. This year they were not. But again, when you dive into the data, you'll see that it was much lower. Touchdown to interception ratio, Notre Dame is not that far off what some of these teams have been. I think Notre Dame's touchdown to interception ratio this year was fine. I had no issue with it. Because you had a lot of short, you got a lot of situations where a lot of teams might throw inside the 5, but between Riley Leonard and Jeremiah Love, it's like, why throw down there when you have two dynamic short yardage or
Sure.
red zone type of guys? But overall, those numbers are fine compared to other teams. It's not so much that it's the when and the how. Obviously, look at 2018. Some of those numbers are a little bit skewed from the difference between when the Brandon Wimbush era to the Riley Leonard era. And then the last part's quarterback rating. You look at Notre Dame, the minimum, the lowest is 154.65. The next lowest after that's 161.98. Notre Dame has only been over 150 twice. 153 back in 19. But again, as we talked about, Trevor, that was a year where Notre Dame played a really soft schedule and did not perform well in the big games that season. So if you actually look at their 2019 passing against Georgia, the game they lost, 5.9 yards per attempt, 116.38 passer rating. Against Michigan, the other game they lost, 4.6 yards per attempt, 99.21 passer rating. Their ranking that year was as high as it was because they went for 264.19 against Navy. They went for 271.31 against New Mexico. They went for 256.89 against Bowling Green. They had a couple dominant performances against really bad teams, 172.07 against a bad Iowa State team. But against some of the better teams in the schedule, they were not good. As I mentioned, the 116 against Georgia, only 145 against Louisville, 123 against Virginia, 106.75 against USC, 112.88 against Virginia Tech. And so you started to play some of these better teams and your numbers plummet. So the numbers are skewed by dominant performances. But when you look at a lot of the teams that are winning championships, they're actually staying closer to their season-long averages against those better teams. You never like do better against the best teams than you do the worst teams. That's just not how it works. But you don't have these giant drop-offs. And that's what we've seen from Notre Dame in the past game. And then the other piece too is, like I mentioned before, is the completion percentage factors into that. The yards per attempt factors into that. A lot of that goes into that rating average. And then for the most part, they do turn the ball over a little bit more in the pass game than a lot of those teams have as well. They went 8, 9, 11, and 10 the last 4 years. The championship teams have been 10, 5, 7, and 12. To a degree, I can live with that a little bit, though, as long as it's for the right reasons. But if you break down those numbers, they're not exactly happening for the right reasons. They're bad picks. They're pick sixes. They're drive-killing interceptions. They're not the 3rd and 9, it's your own 45 shot you take that gets picked off down the field. I can live with that. That's fine. These are devastating turnovers in a lot of in past years where it's pick sixes or setting the other team up for short fields or just killing, comeback attempts with those type of plays. And so I did find it fascinating, Trevor, to see how many areas where Notre Dame is just so woefully fallen short. But I also think you have to be able to look and say some years you've had a guy like a Riley Leonard in 2024 that was able to overcome the lack of passing success because he was so dynamic with his legs. But you can't count on that in a lot of years. Riley Leonard is a bit of a unique player. You're going to have to get a lot better throwing the football. And not just under Riley Leonard. This isn't even because it can come across as like, well, Riley, you don't have Riley anymore. Guys, this has been a problem at Notre Dame for a long time. And I can go back. I mean, the last time I'd say Notre Dame probably threw the ball at a really championship level was back in 2009 with Jimmy Clausen. But that team stunk because why? You couldn't run the football and you play terrible defense. So this isn't the only thing, but this is Notre Dame already has a lot of ingredients that are there to be a championship team defensively, run game wise. Now it's time to get this part of the offense going. And honestly, that's a big reason why Mike Denbrock was brought in to run the offense. I mean, because Mike Denbrock is not an air raid, pass-happy guy. He understands the importance of being able to throw the football, but he's also someone who understands that we've got to be more dynamic throwing the football. And if you look at it, Trevor, I'm going to pull this up again. It's not the volume that bothers me. Notre Dame the last 3 years, 27.8, 27.0, 26.0. Ohio State this year was at 28.4. Michigan was at 24.1. Georgia in 2021 was at 27.1. The attempts are not there. You got to be more efficient with it. You got to be more explosive with it. And that's going to be a big part of it. Because one number I didn't put in here that's going to look very different if you bring in those other teams is going to be big plays. And that's something that Notre Dame lacked this year and honestly lacked in a lot of years, is being able to get those big passing plays from scrimmage, those the home run type of plays. And this year, for example, they had 5 passing plays of 40 yards or more. Michigan the year before only had 5 as well in one more game. But as I've pointed out, Michigan's the anomaly. They're the team that you can't look at and say, well, that's what you've got to be. But, it shows you don't have – but the reason I'd still point to that is it shows you don't have to be LSU 2019 either. There's a happy medium between that and the anomaly that was Michigan. But when you look at a lot of the other teams, Trevor, they're getting a lot more than that. But you don't have to be this team that's just airing it out, chucking it all over the field. Just, it's about the efficiency part. Notre Dame this year had 16 plays of 30 yards or more in the pass game. Georgia in 2022, when they had their best pass offense, only had 23 in 15 games. Now, that's obviously more, but it's not like they were out there just bombing people with it. What's funny is if you look at Georgia, let me pull this back up. What's interesting is Georgia in 2021 averaged 8.1 yards per attempt, and Georgia in 2022 had 8.0, very similar yards per catch. But what's interesting is Georgia 2021 had 30 plays of 15 to 30 yards or more, where the year before they only had 23. Well, they threw it a lot more that first year that they won the title in 21. Actually, that's Notre Dame. Excuse me. I'm looking at the wrong team. So Georgia in 2021 was 9.3. The second year, they were 9.0 yards per attempt. They were at 14.3 in 2021, 13.2 in 2022. So those are very similar numbers. Quarterback rating 168 to 161. What was different? One year they threw it a lot more than the other year. What's interesting, though, is the year they threw it less, they had more big plays. So in 2021, they had more big plays. They had 30 plays of 30 yards or more compared to just 23 in 2021. And so I did find that pretty interesting looking at it. They had 8 plays of 50 yards or more in 2021. And in 2022, they had 5. So even though they threw it a lot more in 2022, model the 2021 season and you're going to be fine. Obviously, you want to limit the interceptions, but they threw the ball 5 times less. They were right on par with where Notre Dame is, 27.1 attempts per game. Notre Dame this past year was at 27.8. They were at 17.6 completions. Notre Dame was at 18.5, so Notre Dame was better there. Completion percentage, Notre Dame was better. Notre Dame had 66.5. Georgia was at 64.9. But look at the big difference. 9.3 yards per attempt, 14 3-point yards per completion. Notre Dame was a 7-1 and 10-7. Notre Dame's 2023 numbers are almost identical to what Georgia was in 2021 in a lot of different areas. But again, I point to it's not just about the raw numbers. It's also about how you put those numbers together. And when you look at Georgia in 2021, Trevor, 10.7 against yards per attempt against Michigan, and the semis 8.6 against Alabama in the championship game. That's the difference. 12.5 in a win over a ranked Kentucky team. That's the difference. That's the difference of why this team was effective, is because they were able to do it. And then you look at the Alabama game in the title game, they went 17 of 26, only threw for 224 yards, but at 8.6 yards per attempt, and had a quarterback rating of 163. In the conference championship game against Bama, they went 29 of 48 for 340 yards, 3 touchdowns, but they got blown out because they threw 2 picks and only averaged 7.1 yards per attempt. So efficiency and explosiveness is better than volume. And that's something that you have to understand, but then being able to do it in the big moments, that's the big key. Alabama in 2022, or Georgia in 2022, in the SEC title game, semifinal game, and championship game, 9.4 yards per attempt, 11.7, and 12.0. And their win over then, I think, number 1 or number 2 ranked Tennessee, 10.3 yards per attempt. And a win over a ranked South Carolina team, 11.3. And a win over Oregon, 11.9. So in 2022, overall, their numbers were not as good as they were in 2021, but they were way better in the big moments. And that's the key. That's the key.
And to paint the picture of how much the big moments mean, Bryan, if you could you switch over to the Notre Dame stats when you get the chance? When you go through and you look at what this means for Notre Dame specifically, one, why does this impact matter? Why does it matter that the offense improves from a passing game standpoint, inefficiency numbers? Well, in 3 of these years that's listed out here, Notre Dame made the playoffs. Right. So we're not talking about some 8-5 team that, man, if their passing was better, maybe they would have won a national championship. This past season, they played in one. In 18 and 20, they were in the semifinals. Now, mind you, it was a 4-team playoff, but it was still the college football playoff semifinals. So you go through and you look at what those numbers mean. And in the big moments, to paint this picture, in 2023, they had more yards per game. They averaged more yards per attempt. They averaged more yards per catch, and they had more passing touchdowns. And the passer rating was higher. However, the difference in the big moments is Riley Leonard went for 8.2 against Ohio State in the national championship. He went for 9.7 against Penn State in the semifinals. That 2023 passing offense wouldn't have done that based on what the numbers tell us. And that's the biggest difference, right? That's the difference between, you can't just look at the raw numbers without context, because if I were to just show this, even if you take the name out of it, even if you take Notre Dame out of there and you just look at 24 and 23, if I were to ask people who had the better passing offense, the resounding answer would be 2023 based on the numbers. But when you look at everything with context, and when you look at what they did in those moments with those numbers, 24 was trending in the right direction in terms of when it was happening, right? The big moments, the big games. And that's the picture that we're trying to paint, is Notre Dame's this close. Right? There's aspects of their team that needs to remain consistent. They still need to be able to run the ball at a high level. They still need to have an elite defense. And when you go through and you look at 2018 through 2024, that was pretty consistent. They had really good defenses in those years. They were able to run the football really efficiently in those years. This is the area of the offense that fluctuates for many different reasons that we're going to continue to break down throughout the show. But when you just look at the direction that they're trending in, the personnel groups that are going to be there in 2025, what it means for Denbrock's second year, that's what leaves people excited about what this could potentially look like. But to paint the picture of why that's so important, it's that. It's what do those numbers mean in the big moments? Because Riley Leonard was above 7.1 yards per attempt in the semifinals and in the national championship game. If that can continue to improve, it's going to be huge. It's going to be really huge for this offense, Bryan.
There's no doubt. I mean, and again, it's the formula's there. Knowing what to do is not the problem. The problem is can you then go out and do it? And Trevor, when that's really when you have these conversations, that's really what it comes down to is we know the recipe. We know what needs to happen. We know what this team needs to do. But the question is, can you then go out there and do it? And it's kind of like, look, I can identify what your sickness is, but I can't do anything about it. Like, hey, I know what that sounds like. That you got a cold, you got the flu. All right, cool. We've identified the problem. Now let's go fix it. What should I do? I don't know. My mom always tells me what to do. I have no clue what you should do. I'm just letting you know that's what the deal is, that you have the flu. I just thought you'd want to know that. And so that thing is, can you fix it? Can you fix the problem? And that's what Notre Dame is, going to have to be able to do is be able to identify the problem, because at the end of the day, man, it's as you mentioned, you're just gonna have to be better in those moments. You're gonna have to be better in those big games. And you look at this year compared to last year. I love that you pointed that out, because last year Sam Hartman played in what I would consider 6 big games against teams that were ranked. And when you look at the results, they weren't good. I mean, they weren't good. He didn't do enough. I mean, yeah, you averaged more yards per attempt, but last year in those 6 big games, he threw 9 touchdown passes. This year, Riley Leonard threw 8. 4 of those touchdown passes came in one game against NC State. And then in the rest of them, in the other 5 games, he threw 5 touchdowns and he threw 5 picks. And you just look at it and you're just like, that's just not good enough. And that's been the story for a long time. And there was times this year. This isn't a defend Riley Leonard and let's convince everyone how great Riley Leonard was, because there was times this year that Riley Leonard wasn't good enough as a passer. The Georgia game, let's be honest, he wasn't good enough as a passer in that game. He had one moment where he had to step up and make a play, and he made it. That's great. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, but, he didn't overall. But what was the difference? Is Riley Leonard at least had that one trait that could kind of get you over the top. And past quarterbacks haven't had that. Past quarterbacks, I mean, you could look at like a Brandon Wimbush and guys like that, but we're talking about he was so far below as a passer. It's just a different conversation. But when you look at like a Sam Hartman, if he wasn't on throwing the football, he wasn't going to be effective. I mean, he couldn't help you. Whereas Riley Leonard can go pass for 90 yards in a game and beat Georgia. I mean, that's the difference. And you can't always count on that. That's the thing, is you can't always count on that. And here's the thing I'll give credit to Riley Leonard for this year. He usually made big plays with his arm when it mattered. Like, even if you look at the Georgia game, he made a couple really clutch throws in that game, even though overall he didn't do anything throwing the football. You look at the Texas A&M game, he didn't throw the ball very well against Texas A&M overall, but he had a couple big throws on that last drive where Notre Dame was trying to win the football game. And you look at the same thing against Penn State. I mean, he had 2 huge mistakes in that game. But when the game was on the line, Riley made the plays he needed to make. Same thing against Ohio State to battle back. Same thing against Indiana, even those overall numbers weren't good. And you need that. But at the same time, you also then need to have all those other things. You can't have and this has been the issue. You've got this issue, you got that issue. You're great here, you're great there, but then it's those other things that hold them back. And at some point in time, Notre Dame's going to have to get to the point where throwing the football, whether throwing it 20 times a game or 40 times a game, and I hope they're never at 40 times a game, because that's probably a bad sign. But it's just, you need to be better at it when you do it. You need to be more dangerous with it when you do it. And at the end of the day, the numbers show that. And why? You've got to protect your pass game better. You've got to be able to be more balanced, to force teams to defend you more straight up, as opposed to teams that are just focusing on stopping your run. And if they are going to focus on stopping your run, you need to be able to make them pay in a big, big way. And Notre Dame wasn't able to do that enough. They did it for about a full game in the playoff, in the semifinals and the championship, if you look at the second half of each game. But because they couldn't do it in the first half, they weren't as effective with it. And so those are the things you look at, Trevor, and say it makes you better. If you can throw the ball better, you're going to be better on third down. If you throw the ball better, you're going to be able to score more. If you throw the ball better, you're going to be able to run the ball more effectively at Notre Dame. And now some teams throw, and that's the focus of their offense. Notre Dame doesn't need to be that. We are not advocating for that. We are of the belief. I shouldn't speak for both of us, Trevor. I get this impression from you, but you haven't exactly said it. Notre Dame should always be a team that puts a great deal of emphasis on being able to run the football as well as any team in the country. Again, not from a volume standpoint, but from an effectiveness standpoint. But in order to do that, you have to have a passing game that is more complementary, more effectively complementary than what you've had in a lot of years. And even the 1 year, if you look at like 2021, where Notre Dame had some really good pass game numbers, 282.5 yards per game, had this third highest completion percentage of that time under Jack Cohn. You had 8.1 yards per attempt, 12.7 yards per completions, 30 touchdowns, decent passer rating. If you look at just Jack Cohn's rating of what it was that season, there's a lot of things that you look at that you like, Trevor. Jack Cohn that year was actually 151.83 as a pass with his passer rating. So just kind of looking at it from that standpoint of where he was actually higher because Ian Book. So 2019 Notre Dame's passer rating is 153.48. I should have put the starter passer rating because Ian Book was only 149.13. They were there because Phil Jurkovec went 12 of 16 for 222 yards and had 2 touchdowns. He averaged 13.9 yards per attempt and had a passer rating of 232.8. That jumped that rating up. Oh, and Brendan Clark threw 1 pass that year and went for a 22-yard touchdown. So your backup quarterbacks went 13 of 17 for 244 yards, 3 touchdowns, and no picks, and had a passer rating that was probably in the 400s. So that dragged that number up. It was really 149, whereas Jack Cohn was at 151.83 that season and had a completion percentage of 65.5 and did a lot of good things. And I've said in the past that if Jack Cohn would have had one more year left and could have been on that team in 2022, that Notre Dame would have been real, real dangerous. Why do I say that? Because in 2021, even with Kyron Williams, who was a heck of a player, Notre Dame's run game stunk. Kyron rushed for 1,005 yards, but only went for 4.9 yards per carry. Why? Because your offensive line was a mess. You only averaged 144 yards a game. Could you imagine what Jack Cohn could have done in 2022 with an offense that averaged 189.1 rushing yards per game? Could you imagine that? No. And so that's the thing. It's like you got to be able to put it all together. And right now, I believe that Notre Dame is on the verge of having the type of run game needed to be a championship team, and we saw that this year. But where Notre Dame got in trouble in the postseason is when teams put all their chips into stopping the run game, and the Notre Dame offensive line struggled to have good performances in the run game. They didn't have a pass game good enough to really to win those games in the degree they could. But we did see some flashes, Trev. And the Penn State game was a great example of that, second half against Ohio State. But because you couldn't do it for 4 quarters is why you needed that comeback late in both games. And that's where they've got to get to. So they've had it at times, but not enough. And that's what we're going to have to see moving forward is they can do it more consistently and more effectively.
Complementary football is going to be a huge, huge thing to talk about in 2025. And I look to almost the anomaly year, but you could say this consistently throughout, but I like using this example, is J.J. McCarthy in the 2023 season. Because he's somebody that I've given him my fair share of flack for. I didn't think he was elite and yada, yada, yada. But you go through and you look at what is a balanced offense.
He wasn't. He wasn't, by the way. You're not wrong on that. But
agreed. Yeah. But with that being said, Michigan's passing offense did what they needed to depending on what the game was. And that is something that can't be said for Notre Dame's passing offense in recent years, using the most recent one as an example. You go through and you look at what J.J. McCarthy did, and obviously the stat line everybody throws out is what he did against a ranked Penn State team. 7 of 8 for 60 yards. No touchdowns, no interceptions. However, Once the postseason came around, right, in the semifinals against Alabama, he went 17 of 27 for 221 yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 0 interceptions, because Alabama's whole goal was to shut down Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards. And so there had to be an answer. Penn State wasn't able to stop Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards, so J.J. McCarthy didn't have to pass. It was a really ugly, really boring game. But in terms of winning the game for Michigan, they did what they needed to. And that's something that Notre Dame has to get to in 2025.
Let's look at the numbers, Trev. I mean, to back up your point, when you look at J.J. McCarthy and the performance he had, he didn't need to throw the ball against Washington. I mean, they ran for over 300 yards that game. It wasn't needed. He could just go out there and just kind of make a couple plays here and there, but they were just ran all over Washington. But to your point, it was not the case in the semifinal game against Alabama, because Alabama was able to shut their run game down. They ran for 130 yards on 32 carries, and 37 of those yards came on 2 carries, a scramble by J.J. McCarthy and a 21-yard run by Blake Corum. Donovan Edwards only had 11 yards on 4 carries. He had the 21-yard gain, but Corum's other 18 carries only went for 62 yards. They still needed overtime to win that game. They needed JJ to step up and make some plays in the pass game. He didn't throw for 400 yards. He only threw for 221. But he passed for 200. He went 17 of 27 for 221 yards, and he had 3 touchdowns and no picks. But even more importantly, besides just the numbers, which weren't lights out, 8.2 yards per attempt it's a good number, but it's not a lights out number. 13 yards per completion is a good number, but 8.2 and 13 in a college football playoff semifinals, a good number against a good defense. But it was the efficiency that he had, 3 touchdowns, no picks, but it was also the moments. He made those big plays in the moments. I think of him hitting Roman Wilson a couple times in some really big moments in that game. He had a couple huge throws to Colton Loveland. So you and I can agree that I'm not putting J.J. McCarthy in the same level as a Joe Burrow and Trevor Lawrence and some of these big time quarterbacks that have Mac Jones, but he made the plays that he needed to make. And he did that against Penn State 2023, but he's not doing that against Penn State 2024, because there's a better version of Penn State. And when you break it down, Trev, that's where I come from. Is it's one thing to have the success you have, but it's another thing to have it in the biggest moments. And Michigan in 2023 averaged 12.3 yards per completion. But in the semifinal game against Bama, when they needed it most, they were at 13 yards per attempt or yards per completion. And that was the big key. It was happening when they needed most. And when you look at Notre Dame, that's been a big thing, is even when the numbers are good, they're not good in the big moments. And there's always a different reason why. And you say, well, Sam Hartman wasn't good enough. Well, is that really the reason? What would Sam Hartman have done with this offensive coordinator and this year's run game plus this year's pass catchers and this year's coordinator? Would he have been any better? We don't know the answer to that. Would Jack Cohn have been better in 2022? We can speculate all we want, and I think he would have been, but we don't know the answer to that, because the point is there's always been something missing from all those different teams. And recruiting, coaching, all that stuff is going to fix it, Trev, and get him to that point. So that's the reason why. We'll get in sort of the issues that they've had. Next, we're going to get into what we need to see. So we've addressed the problem. We've talked about the problem in parts 1 and 2 of this show. But next, we're going to get into what's going to lead to better play, what's going to lead to better performances, and going to have some fun breaking that down. But before we get there, folks, do me a favor, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, we would greatly appreciate if you would give us a 5-star review. And of course, as always, make sure you've signed up for the message board at the Champions Lounge Premium Board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. That is always the best way to support us. Even if you're not a message board person, but you want to support what we're doing, you're not someone who gets on the message board, but you're listening to our show for free every day and you appreciate that, you can still sign up for the message board that way, either as a monthly member, an annual member. You can join one of our booster clubs. If you join the booster club, you get some free merch. You get a free, if you're a Shamrock or a Blue Club member, you get a free IB Club mug, which goes only to IB Club members. If you join the Gold Club, you get a free IB Club mug and an IB Gold Club t-shirt as well. So you can check those out. But again, you don't have to be someone who's always on the message board. It's also a way to just support what we're doing at Irish Breakdown. So you can check that out at boards.irishbreakdown.com.